Welcome to the show, Jay Jog from Sei Labs, the team building Sei blockchain. Thank you for joining us. Really excited to have you. There's been a lot of attention on Sei recently, and I think we're going to learn a lot today.
Yeah, man. Thanks for having me on, Patrick.
Awesome. So to start, I'll leave it to you to do the full introduction. Can you share a little bit about yourself and your background, and how you got into crypto?
Yeah, of course. I'm a co-founder for Sei. My background, I grew up in the Silicon Valley Bay Area. So I've been here for most of my life. Studied computer science in college, and I ended up getting into crypto initially back in 2017. My roommate at the time, he was going through Binance Labs. So I ended up working together with him on tinkering on a few different smart contracts. And that was my original foray into doing crypto development. Afterwards, I ended up joining Robinhood. So the brokerage that was kind of involved with the entire GameStop saga back in 2021. So I spent almost 4 years over there. I saw the company more than 10x, and I was an engineering lead when the entire saga happened. It's been almost 3 years now. For any listeners that might not be super familiar with it, at that time there were around a dozen meme stocks. So these are stocks like GameStop. Another one would be AMC, and these were all stocks that were essentially just pumping straight to the moon. What was happening is that these retail people from subreddits like Wall Street Bets, they were really rallying behind these companies. And Wall Street was like, wait a minute, there's not really much fundamental value backing a lot of the price action that's happening. So Wall Street decided to start shorting a lot of these stocks. And then there ended up being a short squeeze that happened. And a short squeeze is when people that are trying to short a stock, which is betting against it, they realize that they're losing a bunch of money, so they want to close their position. But in order to close their position, they need to buy back the stock, which leads to more upwards price action. So it just became this entirely kind of crazy time. During this time, just like Robinhood was the one where a lot of this activity was happening. There are a bunch of younger folks that were coming onto Robinhood and opening these positions. And initially it was great, right? Like everyone was super happy. Retail was winning, Wall Street was losing. But then just totally out of the blue one day, Robinhood decided to turn off buys. So no one was able to buy GameStop or AMC or any of these other stocks. And Robinhood had extremely poor communication around this. Like it was just completely opaque, right? And this was just a complete shit show. So from the outside looking in, like Patrick, if you were watching it, you were like hella confused, like what is actually happening here?
Yeah.
As an insider, I was equally as confused because they did not tell us anything.
Really?
Like I had no idea why decisions were being made the way that they were. And basically all the time, like we would find out about things at the same time that there was like some kind of news publication that announced it. So we had like people were pinging me, right? Like my friends were hitting me up, people from my team were asking me questions, and I really had nothing to be telling them about like what is actually going on. In hindsight, I don't think Robinhood was doing anything malicious. I think that it's been a few years now. There's been a ton of stuff that's been like looked into around it. I don't think Robinhood was doing anything malicious, but the way that it was handled was extremely bad. It was completely opaque. Going through that entire experience, it makes you just feel so powerless, right? Like you have no agency, you have no idea what's going on. And that made me a decentralization maxi because anything that happens on chain is inherently trustless. And that was the origin story for Sei. We wanted to try building something like Robinhood, except building it on chain. And that's why back in 2021, my co-founder Jeff and I, we both decided to start looking into building a DEX. This then led to us looking into all of the infrastructure we could use to build an exchange on chain. We realized that it really wasn't that good. Like if you're trying to build on Ethereum or on an Ethereum rollup, you were very much bandwidth bound. Like you weren't able to have very high like transactions per second. Even on Ethereum L1 right now, you're getting around like 10 to 20 TPS. On rollups on Ethereum, you're getting like 30 TPS. So if you want to build like an order book based exchange that needs more than 30 transactions happening per second, you just cannot. Not if you're using Ethereum for data availability. So that was kind of out of the question. At that time, we were also looking into Solana as an option, and it didn't really, 2021, I think Solana was in a much different kind of spot than it has been since then. At that time, Solana didn't really make much sense. And I think even right now, there's like trade-offs around using Solana. So all things considered, we're like, okay, existing infrastructure really doesn't work. Let's just build our own infrastructure layer to support these exchanges. That was kind of the inspiration for building Sei as layer one.
Interesting. First, really interesting to hear that you were in the dark in Robinhood as well. It's crazy that's 3 years ago because there's probably a lot of people who have gotten into crypto, you know, who weren't trading at all back then. Whereas to me, that was like such a big moment in 2021. I remember it distinctly on my side because I had bought a bunch of options on AMC like right when it started to move,
Mhm.
and they still ended up being valuable, but not as valuable as they were when buying was turned off.
Yeah.
But that's really interesting to hear. And so started off building a DEX, transitioned
Mhm.
to just building infrastructure behind it. Can you share a little bit more about how that transition took place? And do you still have a vision of, say, fulfilling that role of an on-chain order book?
Mhm. Yeah. So internally at Sei, we have just one core thesis, which is that the exchange of digital assets is the most fundamental use case for blockchains. Like every single thing in crypto that has found product market fit, or has even gotten a lot of traction, like every single thing is either directly an exchange or indirectly gets all of its demand from trading. So, I mean, if you look at a few different categories, like you can look at things like Uniswap, OpenSea. These are very clearly exchanges, right? Like the main thing you go over there and you do is like you trade different types of assets. But even if you look at games, like if you look at StepN, one of the biggest sources of on-chain activity for StepN is its in-game marketplace. That's what kind of drives a lot of the activity on the kind of game overall. So StepN directly gets its activity from the exchange of digital assets. And even if you look at something like Aave or look at something like MetaMask, the reason people go and like borrow money is then to be able to go and trade it on chain. And the reason that people install wallets in many cases is to just be able to go on chain and then trade as well. So everything in crypto is tied to trading. The question is then, how do you help it scale? How do you help it grow bigger? Because right now there's definitely writing on the wall that there's going to be more activity starting to happen on chain in the future. There's just more acceptance of crypto, and there's also more regulation happening on centralized entities, which is going to result in some of that activity starting to move on chain. So yeah, I mean that's the most fundamental question. Like, how do you have this trading activity happen on chain? We don't think that the current infrastructure can really support that, which was why back in like initially we're trying to build a DEX. To I guess your original question, um, and then we're like, okay, how does this mechanically actually work? So we explored different ecosystems to build it on, and building smart contracts on chain didn't really work. And that's when we're like, okay, let's just try to build a separate layer one instead. So this transition happened around March of 2022. And that's when we started building a layer one. And since then, we realized that, okay, building the core infrastructure offers a lot of utility to teams. The second we start building an application on that infrastructure ourselves, suddenly it becomes much less valuable and strategic for teams to start building in that ecosystem. Because if you're just building a layer one and you are credibly neutral, then strategically it makes a lot of sense for exchanges to come and build on top of you, right? But if you're building a layer one and you're also building the core exchange on that layer one, then
Mhm,
suddenly it makes no sense for other exchanges to come and compete against your
mhm.
exchange because that's kind of a losing proposition for them. So that's why I say is just infrastructure. We're not trying to build any kind of application because that detracts a lot from the value proposition for builders.
Okay, interesting. And what was the reasoning behind becoming a multi-purpose layer one that other developers could build on versus doing an app chain for order book decks?
Yeah, yeah. So if you look at the distribution of layer ones out there, they basically fall under two extremes. On one hand, you have general purpose chains, and on the other hand, you have app chains. So we think that app chains are really good for certain things. Like if you're trying to build really specialized infrastructure for one particular type of use case, then app chains end up being like they give you the best type of infrastructure because you're literally building it around one specific use case. So I think that's the core value proposition for app chains. The downside, though, is that social coordination with app chains is extremely difficult. Like if you're trying to build an ecosystem, um, and let's say you're like a Solana, every single team building on Solana is part of that Solana family, and they all help that ecosystem grow. They all help that ecosystem succeed, and it becomes much more feasible for Solana to do well. If you're building your own app chain, there's just like one type of application. You're kind of screaming into the abyss when you're trying to grow out the ecosystem. It's really hard to get that type of social coordination to happen. So if the goal is to build an ecosystem, the general purpose approach ends up being a lot better. Another thing that we realized is that everything in crypto is tied to trading, as we're kind of talking about before. So trying to be very restrictive in allowing the types of applications that are supported doesn't make much sense, because the question is like, where do you draw the line? Like, do you draw the line on only allowing spot exchanges to be there? Well, okay, if you expand it past that, then do you allow like perps and stuff? And then if you expand past that, do you allow like NFT activity and like gaming activity? Like, there's no real line that you can draw. Everything in crypto is tied to trading. So fundamentally, building some kind of general purpose chain makes the most sense.
It does make a lot of sense. Want to step back a second. Can you go a little bit into the tech behind Sei and what makes it different from other high throughput layer ones?
Of course. So in terms of Sei V1, and we'll talk about Sei V2 pretty soon, I'm sure. Sei V1 is the fastest layer one for trading. And there's several different changes that we made. A couple of the ones that I'll touch on are tied to consensus and execution. So Sei makes use of twin turbo consensus, which helps to get 390 millisecond time to finality. For context, this is essentially 10x faster than most other ecosystems out there. Like in Solana's case, for example, you might have a block that is created every like 400 to 600 milliseconds, but it's not finalized for more than 3 to 4 seconds. So it ends up being just an order of magnitude faster over there. The way that this is done from the consensus side is we changed the way how block propagation works and how block processing works. So there were two improvements that we made, which is why it's called twin turbo consensus. And that helped substantially improve that time to finality. For more of the execution layer side, one of the bigger improvements we made was parallelization, which I'm sure we'll talk about a little bit later as well. But at a high level, parallelization lets you run multiple transactions at the same time, which helps speed up the chain. So from both of those improvements, we're able to get down to that 390 millisecond time to finality number.
Awesome. And then to sort of tie it back to people using the application, for those who are watching that might not understand why it matters, the time to finality, can you maybe give an example of what that would look like from a user experience?
Mm-hmm. So if you go to Sei right now and you like buy some token or you like buy an NFT, you basically approve the transaction and then it'll get filled, like it'll get finalized almost instantly. So there'll be like that pop-up that comes up and then it'll just be like, boom, it's done. If you go to Ethereum and you try to do the same thing, it's going to take a much longer time. Like it'll be kind of floating. You go to Etherscan, you wait for it. It's like pending transaction. Then you wait for it some more, and then afterwards get finalized. So from a user experience standpoint, faster finality just means that things happen a lot faster, which leads to a much, much more seamless user experience. Other chains try to have this approach of having multi-slot finality, which is where you might have a block that gets created fast, but it's not finalized quickly. And the issue with that is that it's possible for there to be a reorg. And what a reorg is basically like a block is added to the network, but then that specific chain is discarded and then a different chain is considered instead. And this leads to scenarios where like you might think a transaction has been accepted, but it hasn't. And then it just creates a bunch of complications for like the normal user. And then if you're like a market maker or someone trying to do like sophisticated trading on chain, reorgs definitely represent more risk for you. So it results in you needing to account for that risk by offering wider spreads on chain. And then suddenly that leads to worse trading experiences on chain as well. So we think the single slot finality approach is a no-brainer for the future. Interestingly, recently, Ethereum also updated their longer term roadmap to focus on single slot finality. So I think a pretty big portion of the crypto world is moving in that direction now as well.
Oh, interesting. Before we get on to Sei V2 and the future of Sei, one word you mentioned was parallelization, and I know that's kind of become a buzzword in the crypto world recently, partially
Yeah.
because of Sei, I think, as well as some issues that were happening on other chains with inscriptions. Can you talk a little bit about what exactly parallelization is and why people should care about it?
Yeah. So if you look at the EVM right now, which is the Ethereum virtual machine, so let's just say you look at Ethereum L1, the way that transactions are processed is if you have 100 transactions, they'll all get processed one after the other. This is really simple, but the downside there is you're not taking advantage of modern hardware. The phones that people are listening to this on, or the laptops that they're listening to this on, are capable of processing transactions or processing multiple things at the same time. Like most of the devices that are going to be used to listen to this, they're going to be having multiple cores. And that's true for basically all modern hardware. If you have multiple cores, you're able to process multiple work streams at the same time. So the idea with parallelization is you take advantage of this modern hardware. And if you have some kind of workload coming in, let's say 100 transactions, you try to process as many of them at the same time as you can. And when you process, let's say 100 transactions with like 10 being processed at the same time, then suddenly you're able to process things a lot faster, which helps improve the time to process a certain number of transactions, which then helps either both improve throughput and also decrease the time it takes to finalize and process transactions. So this is something that is relatively underexplored in crypto right now. Solana was the first major chain to make use of parallelization and kind of get traction with that. But like if you look at the Ethereum, like any Ethereum-based chain right now, literally none of them are using parallelization. And that's a significant opportunity to help improve performance.
Interesting. And I think that leads us into Sei V2, but I'll let you explain what that is.
Yeah.
When was this announced?
So
Announced in November, December?
it was announced at the end of November.
End of
So for
November.
a little bit of the timeline here, we started building Sei V1 March of 2022. Then August of 2023 is when Sei mainnet was released. So this is when everyone started using it. And I mean, overall, there's a ton of things that have been going extremely well with Sei V1. For example, from a technical side, we've seen a sustained 390 millisecond time to finality. Like everything's been going very stably on mainnet. The biggest request from developers, though, was to have EVM compatibility. Because if you're a crypto native engineer, you're going to be familiar with the EVM already. And moving over to a new kind of execution environment represents a pretty significant threat for you. Because if you make even a small mistake, like let's say you're writing a Rust-based smart contract for Cosmosm, you make even a small mistake, then suddenly your entire contract can get drained. And your entire project could just die because of that one small mistake you made because you weren't as familiar with the nuances of the new execution environment. So that's why we realized, okay, we need to support the EVM. And this is something we'd already started working on back in August of 2022. So at this point, almost a year and a half ago, we'd already gotten started working on that. But then we're like, okay, we need to make sure that this gets kind of prioritized as quickly as we can. And yeah, I mean, we started working on parallelization, improving the way that state access works, and also improving the execution side of things by adding in EVM support. And that's what Sei V2 is. It is the first parallelized EVM. And this essentially allows you to get the best of both Ethereum and Solana because you're able to have a really fast execution environment while also having EVM support. And as a result, all the tooling, mindshare, and all the resources that already exist with the EVM. And yeah, I mean, it's actually been pretty wild to see just how much excitement there has been around this. Because we announced it, I think, on November 29th. So since then, there's just been a massive uptick in the amount of conversations happening about Sei. And a lot of people are quite excited about the possibility of scaling the EVM.
Mm-hmm. Did you expect that when you made the announcement?
Yeah, I mean, I think that when we announced it was a really interesting time because that's when there was a lot of on-chain activity starting to re-happen on Ethereum. And when you were paying like $50 to $100 for transaction fees, it's suddenly like, wait, this isn't the experience I really want to be having. So I think we ended up like striking a chord with the crypto community just because of the time of that announcement. So yeah, overall, I think that ended up kind of leading to more excitement than maybe if we'd announced it like a year ago or something. But yeah, like one of the interesting things with this is that right now, as I was mentioning before, on Ethereum and on all of the rollups around it, you're really not able to get that many transactions per second. So there's a lot of types of applications you can't build. Like if you want to build an order book-based exchange, you just cannot build that on Ethereum L1 right now. That's like what has been really exciting for developers about Sei V2 because it unlocks an entirely new design space. Like any type of application that needs more than 30 TPS, you basically cannot build that on Ethereum L1. So Sei V2 represents like the most interesting way of bringing those applications on chain.
Oh, fascinating. So you mentioned that that's enticing to developers. How else is Say planning on competing with the more established layer ones?
Hmm. I mean, the biggest differentiator is going to be this high throughput EVM support. That's really not something that any other chain has been able to do successfully before. Um, the entire Ethereum ecosystem right now, the way that it's focused on scaling is through rollups, and that'll help you scale the types of use cases that are being built on chain. It can help you get dedicated block space for certain types of applications as well, but that doesn't really solve the core issue around how do you help actually get greater throughput. Other examples of L1s that have been using the EVM, they haven't really been able to get that either. So we think that this is going to be like the core value proposition. If you're trying to this is in having this high throughput EVM. Um, if you're trying to use a different type of chain with a different execution environment, we don't really think it works as well to be able to grow an ecosystem. And one example of this would be Move VM. So there have been a couple of pretty major chains that have launched in the past
Mhm.
year and a half that have been supporting Move. And I don't really think there's been that much ecosystem traction happening on either of those chains relative to any EVM chain, just because it's really difficult to get crypto native engineers to start building in these new ecosystems. So fundamentally, having this high throughput EVM is something that really makes it easier to grow out that ecosystem.
Awesome. And then final question, because we're running up against time limit now. To anyone watching this who wanted to either start using or get involved with Say, either as a user or builder, where would you recommend they go?
Yeah, so if you're a user, you could you could follow Sei Network on Twitter, and there'll be a ton of resources over there. If you're a builder, you can go to Sei.io, and there's going to be docs over there. So you can go through the docs and learn more about what building on Sei would entail. And I mean, the Sei Labs team would be happy to get in touch to help remove any friction that you're experiencing.
Amazing. And I'll link both of those down below the video when we eventually publish it. Thanks so much for coming on, Jay. Really been a pleasure. I've learned a lot, and I hope that viewers have as well.
All right. Thank you, Patrick. This was fun. I'll see you
Take
later,
care.
man.